We're down to the last episode of the season with another 10-game episode for the ZX Spectrum, and we start this one with a particularly uncommon game that I had the honor of playing in 1986 a couple of times. It's a Finnish text adventure game called Kultakuume, which translates as Gold Rush, and it still hasn't been archived into the International Spectrum Archive websites. Kultakuume was authored by Marko Aho and Kari Aaltonen by using the very capable adventure game creating software called The Quill, accompanied by the graphics editor called The Illustrator, both developed and published by Gilsoft in 1983 and 84 respectively. Marko's old website says Kultakuume was the first text adventure game in Finnish, and it was written in 1985. The publication didn't happen until next year. More to the point, perhaps, Kultakuume was the only commercially released Finnish text adventure ever for the ZX Spectrum. As the name would suggest, it's gold rush time in America, and the year is 1848. The idea is to find passage to the west through some means of transportation and find gold. Easier said than done, of course, since the game has about 100 locations, and the parser isn't the most comfortable to perform any actions with. But for the most part, it's a great and sadly overlooked piece of Finnish gaming history, and I have some oddly vivid memories of it despite my having been only around 5 or 6 years old at the time. If you want to try the game out, it can be found at Marko Aho's website. If you're not a Finnish person, you can find a review of it at the Finnish Retro Game Comparison blog, which features a bunch of translated commands, so it might be easier for a foreigner to get started. Links to both websites can be found in the video description. Another Spectrum game you can find a thing written off at the comparison blog is Imagine's 1983 hit game Jumping Jack, also released as Leggit for the Atari and Dragon computers and cloned to too many other machines by other developers that I can't be bothered to account here. Jumping Jack is a devilishly simplistic platformer in which you control a stickman called Jack, who needs to get from the bottom of the screen all the way to the top by jumping through moving holes in each floor. After completing one level, 2 lines of a limerick will be shown as an intermission before you get to the next level, now with more enemies. And that's all there is to it, really. If it weren't for the funny animations and great loading screen for its time, you would only have simple but addicting gameplay, which should be enough, but it is nice to have some style as well. Being such an early game, Jumping Jack was made to be compatible with the 16K Spectrum, so it loads rather quickly as well, another favorable element to becoming one of my most revisited games in my original Spectrum days, as well as in the more recent years. Today's episode features an oddly large amount of sport games, starting with a rare example of a football game that I used to play a lot on the Spectrum, but hated with a passion on the C64. The game in question is Match Day, released by Ocean Software in 1984. It was designed by John Rittman, who is also known for Bear Bover, the isometric Batman game, and Head Over Heels. According to Rittman himself, as he mentions on his personal website, Match Day was conceived from a request from game distributors to make a Spectrum equivalent of International Soccer on the Commodore 64. Considering International Soccer is still one of the best 8-bit soccer games, it must have been a tough request to fill, but Match Day became one of the best-selling Spectrum games of the year. For the longest time, I felt protective about the Spectrum version, even though I never really sought out to actually play it after my original time period with the Spectrum, and just simply considered the C64 version as hopelessly inferior. So my nostalgia for Match Day was more about the image in my head than actually revisiting the game. So I finally went and did what I shouldn't have done and actually played Match Day on the ZX Spectrum just to get the footage for this episode. It wasn't nearly as good as I remembered it to be, but it did have certain elements in it that made it more memorable than your average soccer game. The modifiable team names, the color options for teams and backgrounds, the opening fanfare coupled with the animation, and it looks better than all the other games of its kind from that time. In gameplay though, it just doesn't hold up, even to international soccer. In order to have some sort of balance in the play, the artificial intelligence should be at least a little bit in your favor, and the running speed of a player holding the ball shouldn't be exactly the same as the speed of all the other players. Perhaps Matchday might work better as a two-player game, but I doubt I will ever be even attempting to play it against a friend. As a nostalgia trip game, Matchday only serves to bring me back to a random hot summer's day in maybe 1985 or 86, while I am enjoying the opening fanfares, and then it's time to reset and load something else. The title for my favorite maze-based arcade adventure game is held between two games from Ultimate Play the Game. One of them is Attic Attack, which was featured earlier in the series, and the second one is Sabre Wulf from 1984. But I would say that I played Sabre Wulf a lot more back in the day, mostly because it worked a lot more often. Much like Attic Attack, Sabre Wulf is another flip-screen maze adventure game, but this one takes place entirely in a single-level jungle maze. Your mission is to locate 4 pieces of an amulet, which enables you to eventually pass the exit from the maze. The jungle is populated by randomly spawning jungle creatures, most of which you can kill with your saber. The weird thing is, you can only swish your saber left and right, but with any luck you might kill some enemies above and below yourself. Some enemies can only be fended off from the screen, and others, like the Untitled Wolf, can only be avoided. You can collect power-ups from differently colored orchids, which can give you some nice boosts, like a temporary invulnerability, or make your life more miserable with reverse controls, or such. Thanks to its lack of proper instructions and randomly placed amulet pieces, Sabre Wulf is a prime example of how to create an addicting maze game, and remains one of the Stamper Brothers' most celebrated games. It's one of my most revisited nostalgia trip games on the Spectrum, so I give it my highest recommendations. I also wrote a comparison of it in 2017, so as usual, a link to the comparison blog can be found from the video description. Next pick was found through emulation about 22 years ago, so for me it qualifies as a nostalgia trip game. Action Reflex was released exclusively for the ZX Spectrum by Mirrorsoft in 1986, so it is likely unfamiliar to gamers outside of the Spectrum community. You control a ball-looking device that moves around rather mechanically. You move it by adjusting the speed indicator left and right, and you can make it jump and bounce gradually up to the ceiling, but all your movements feel very calculated despite the object's roundness. Your mission is surprisingly short, which is just to get through 3 increasingly lengthy levels, with a little help from items you need to pick up along the way. The items are a floater ring, a hammer, and a key, although it is debatable whether you actually need to pick up the keys for any other reason than to get a 100% completion eventually. There are plenty of different kinds of traps you need to navigate around, spikes, vacuums, dart shooting devices, and who knows what, but there are no finite amount of lives here, rather just a time limit for each level. After completing the 3 levels, the game loops from the beginning with a harder difficulty level, as is only to be expected. Despite its name and general look, Action Reflex is more of a puzzle platforming game than an action game. It has become one of my all-time favorite Spectrum games, and it can be played on no other system. If you like quirky puzzle games, this should be right up your alley. Getting back to games I already played and enjoyed back in the 80s, we have Pyjamarama from Microgen, released in 1984. This was the first sequel to Automania, the starter of the Wally Week saga. Following Automania's style, which had proven successful and appealing, the designer Chris Hinsley expanded Wally's world from a 2-roomer to a full house, in similar vein to Matthew Smith's Manic Miner expanding to Jet Set Willy. Of course, since Automania was more about carrying items and combining them with other things, Pyjamarama gave Wally 2 pockets to carry 2 things in. Due to the much larger and more dangerous environment, Wally now also has an energy meter, so you don't instantly die from a brief contact with an enemy. One thing was kept very much the same from the first game, and that's the way Wally moves. The ultimate goal in Pyjamarama is to wake Wally up from his nightmare by finding out how to turn the alarm clock on. But you need to traverse through the entire nightmare version of Wally's house and combine and use items in various places like you would in a good 80s action-adventure game. In certain ways, Pyjamarama could be considered the blueprint for Codemaster's Dizzy games later on, but even Pyjamarama itself took most of its stuff from games like Alchemist from Imagine 1983 and the aforementioned Jet Set Willy from Software Projects 1984. I would say that Pyjamarama could be one of, if not the first computer game ever to feature an inbuilt minigame in it, but I'm not completely sure, so I'll let one of you viewers to comment on that one. Anyway, while it can't be considered one of the most inventive games ever, Pyjamarama makes up for that with charm and humor. Essential Spectrum material to be sure, but it's just about as good on the C64 and Amstrad as well. Time for more sports games then. One of the last games by Imagine Software to having gotten their production started before they were bankrupted and bought by Ocean Software was World Series Baseball. The game was released in 1985 under Ocean's command, but no matter, most of the greatest games released under the Imagine flag were under Ocean's command anyway. Well, the game is baseball, nothing particularly interesting about that. I liked the loading screen and Bob Wakelin's cover art as a kid, even before I knew who Bob Wakelin even was, and there was something very satisfying about how the game worked, and how all the action was magnified through the large screen at the end of the stadium. The animations are still very nice to watch, and the game runs surprisingly smoothly and rapidly. If you're an American, you might recognize the game better as The Slugger, as it was released there for the C64 and later for the IBM PC compatibles through Mastertronic in 1986. For us Europeans, the only correct title for it will ever be World Series Baseball, particularly as it also had a basketball-themed sequel with a similar name and similar Bob Wakelin cover art. That one I have no nostalgia for though, but I hear it's also a very good game, so I might as well recommend it on the side of recommending the first game. So yeah, World Series Baseball and Basketball, both recommended. If you saw the last episode about Commodore 64 games, you might remember seeing Leaderboard Executive Edition there. So, of course, it's only natural that the original Leaderboard should be featured in this Spectrum episode, as it was where I first played it. As I later would find out, of course, compared to the C64 version, the Spectrum version of Leaderboard is a bit sluggish, and there are some minor details that make it a surprisingly different experience from the original. Obviously, the most notable thing is the slower screen drawing speed, but there is something a bit weird about the aiming crosshair too. If you want to know more about the differences between all the versions of Leaderboard, I did write a comparison of it in 2014. Link in the video description as usual. I suppose I'm more drawn towards the Spectrum version of the original Leaderboard purely for nostalgic reasons. It takes me back to those days when Spectrum was the computer in our house, and I remember playing Leaderboard many times during the last summer before my original Spectrum broke down properly and it had to be replaced by a Commodore 64. It was a relatively hot summer too, and if my memory served me well, I didn't do all that much of gaming that summer, so Leaderboard was up there among the most played games of that period. For that reason, it's still a game I like to revisit on the Spectrum more often than I do on the C64, although I do prefer the Executive Edition on the C64 more than this. Another late entry from my original Spectrum obsessions was Zynaps from Houston, also released in 1987. Even though I could never claim to be a fan of side-scrolling space shooters, Zynaps was a game that impressed me back in the day. Of course, at that point, I hadn't seen, much less played, games like Iridium or Nemesis. I only managed to play Zynaps a few times before my original Spectrum broke down for good, so I don't think I ever finished even the first level in it. And when I found and copied the C64 version from a friend's turbo tape collection, it didn't impress me at all. As I later found out, the biggest problem in the C64 version compared to the Spectrum version was that even if you died in the level boss fight, you would be taken to the very beginning of the level. The Spectrum version at least had a spawn point halfway through the level. Also, your spaceship's inertia is a bit less slippery in the Spectrum version. As it happens, I have yet to write a comparison of Zynaps, but it's on my to-do list. It's only in the last year or so that I have actually taken the time to dig back into the Spectrum version of Zynaps and get better at it. And I have actually had some good results. It continues to impress me to this day with some of its unique gameplay solutions, but if compared to games like Nemesis, Salamander and R-Type, it feels a bit needlessly quirky for its own good. Still, it's relatively high on my Spectrum nostalgia trip list. Only after emulation came along, I was able to dig into the 128K Spectrum games. The game I was surprised to see on many top 10 Spectrum game lists back then was an arcade port that was reported to be appalling on the Commodore 64. The game in question is Chase Headquarters, released by Ocean in 1989. And before 1997, my only connection to Chase HQ was magazine adverts. In Chase Headquarters, you drive a police car, straight from Miami Vice, from an outrun-like point of view, and chase after a different fleeing criminal for each stage, through busy traffic and against an annoyingly strict time limit. Your car is equipped with a few turbo injections, which are only effective for a short time, and although the timer resets when you reach the target vehicle, it still takes an inordinate amount of ramming before you can get the criminal to pull over. I have always thought it a bit silly that the game doesn't allow you to just drive past the target vehicle and force the criminal to pull over peacefully. Chase Headquarters is very much an arcade game at heart, and works best in that form. But some of the home conversions work well enough. The 128K Spectrum port is one of the most impressive 8-bit versions out there, along with the 128K Amstrad version. But the Spectrum version is the first one I enjoyed, and I didn't even play the arcade original through the MAME emulator until a few years later. Definitely one of the best latter-day Spectrum classics.